Hello everyone and welcome to Video Odyssey here in Liverpool, where we're delighted to be here because it's Video Odyssey's first birthday. Oh, what a lovely audience. We're absolutely delighted to be here, especially it is the first birthday, but we're here for the headline act because we've got a fantastic director with us this afternoon who we're going to chat to about his wide and varied career, all the way from Edward and Mrs Simpson to Barry Manilow to the far reaches of time and space in Doctor Who. Ladies and gentlemen, please can you put your hands together for Mr Waris Hussain.
Thank you.
Now, welcome to Liverpool, Waris. Now, you've had a fantastic time here over the last
I have, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I have.
And we, with thanks to the BFI as well, who have very kindly loaned us the copy, we've just managed to see one of Play for Today, which you haven't seen since 1976.
That's absolutely right. Yes, I haven't, but I saw it now. I just saw it just now, so I'm happy to have reacquainted myself with it.
And that was Love Letters on Blue Paper.
Love Letters on Blue Paper,
written by Arnold Wesker.
Yes.
Which had Patrick Troughton in a fairly unusual starring role for him, because he's not very rarely been given that kind of material to dig his teeth into.
Well, he was a wonderful actor, so that more or less sealed his reputation as far as I was concerned. You know, I mean, out from the fact he was a Doctor Who's #2, but then he wanted to stretch himself, and actually he did. I think he did brilliantly in this particular part. And actually he played Clement Attlee for me in Edward and Mrs Simpson, for which he shaved his head.
Really?
Yes, all the way bald. Not like me, natural. He had to be unnatural, but he shaved his head.
Fantastic, fantastic. And that isn't the only Play for Today or Wednesday play that you've done. You've had quite a wide variety of plays that you've done. Play of the Month, Passage to India. You also worked with another playwright, Simon Gray, as well.
I did indeed. Simon Gray, who later became a very well-known person in both the theatre and literary terms. I worked with him when he was virtually unknown. We were both virtually unknown at the time. We grew up together. Unfortunately, the shows I did with him, I think we did 3. They've all been wiped by the BBC, and so all we've got are photographs, some stills.
And all the production paperwork. In their infinite wisdom, they kept everything else.
Yes, indeed.
But some of those plays were quite controversial, and it's funny to think of that every Wednesday or every month there was a play that was on that was tackling a controversial issue that was done. I mean, one of the Simon Gray plays that sticks in mind in the work that I've had a look at is one called Sleeping Dog.
Sleeping Dog, I don't think it would ever get made today.
No.
It was about racial prejudice and all sorts of other situations dealing with colonialism, jealousy between age and youth and age. But the basic theme of it was a couple come back from Africa, they're white colonialists, they're waiting to move into their house in the country, they're in a hotel. The gentleman, who is now an aging army gentleman, sees his wife talking to a black bartender, and he's very jealous, takes him back to his house in the country, and inveigles him down to the cellar, where he then puts a collar around his neck and treats him like a dog. Now that sounds very basic, but actually it was pretty harrowing, and it was a comment on the lack of understanding between countries and cultures. I was very fortunate to have fantastic actors playing it, but if you were to try and have that commissioned today, I don't think anyone would do it. It's too sensitive, far too sensitive for what it was. But plays in those days, you have to understand, a lot of people looked forward to the Wednesday play, as they did for Play of the Month. Wednesday nights, oh, we're going to see a play by maybe Harold Pinter, Simon Gray. They were going to be treated to a lot of wonderful performances. To see those on stage, even then, was expensive. Seats were expensive. Now you're getting these kind of talents in your home. So people used to stay in. Now, of course, there's streaming, there's Netflix, everything else. Yeah. But in those days, people had very limited choice. So I was very much a part of that output, I felt as a director I was taking part in something very significant and putting it out to the audience, who could then say, we saw Patrick Troughton, we saw John Gielgud, we saw Laurence Olivier. They were in your drawing rooms. That was the wonderful thing about Play for Today. And then Play of the Month. Those are the biggies. Passage to India, which I did before David Lean, by the way, he did his film, was a Play of the Month with wonderful actors like, in those days, Virginia McKenna, who was a major star, Cyril Cusack, Dame Sybil Thorndike. I mean, this lady, her career started as St. Joan in the 1900s, and I had the privilege of working with one of these iconic actresses from both stage and film. So for me, it was a privilege, and that was Play of the Month. So I'm very proud to have taken over the reins of something as significant as this, from the original, my origins, which is Doctor Who, which is my jumping off point.
We'll come back
as
to
a
Doctor
director,
Who
we'll go back to that
a little bit later.
Yeah.
But one, to pick up on that a little bit, you have all these big names that are coming in, and they are doing, for want of a better expression, theatrical plays, but on television with cameras and not an audience.
Yeah.
And did any of them struggle with that or embrace it? Or
Who, you mean the cast
the
or
cast?
myself?
Yeah.
Well, you see, first of all, I was looking at Love Letters, for instance. That's set in a house. That was all a set. That was not a real house. And it was shot simultaneously with 4 cameras. You can imagine what that meant. Cables, positioning, one camera had to move out of the way while another covered something in order to get the story across. So it was a technical exercise as well as a creative one. The actors and I would be rehearsing for about a week or 10 days in a rehearsal room, in a space rather like this, with everything etched out in yellow tape. That was meant to be the confines of the room with very basic furniture. And we would rehearse for almost 10 days movements from a bed to the desk to the chair to the window. All of that was imagined. It didn't exist. Then they would come onto the set, which they'd not seen until then, and then they'd say, oh my God, this is what we're actually going to be working in. But they'd already firmed up their dialogue. So now it was a question of how we shot it. And just as much as you've been witness to lining up everything today, that was how it happened. We would line up the shots, each shot by shot. And then when we came to shoot it, continuous. Very rarely did we stop unless somebody forgot their lines, and thank God didn't drop dead. But we had to continue. And that was the case with all the dramas I've done, including from Doctor Who onwards. In Doctor Who, by the way, we'll talk about later, only 3 stops per show. And most of those stops are when somebody entered the phone box and entered the TARDIS, because those are 2 separate areas. So it was technical as well as creative.
It's an enormous undertaking, and it's. We were talking before we started about how it's this theatre as television is not something that's seen anymore, really.
It's a technique, and I consider it an art. Not just me, anybody who worked in the medium. But going back to the kind of plays we did, we've already talked about the controversy of Sleeping Dog. Simon Gray was way ahead of his time. And again, so was the BBC, because now there's all this discussion about, gay rights and gay moves and gay plays. He wrote the very first one ever that was I directed it. It was called Spoiled. And it was about a school teacher whose wife is 7 months pregnant. And he's teaching a young Catholic boy extra curriculum in maths at his boy's house. The boy lives with his widowed mother, and the whole theme of it was how the teacher seduces the boy, thereby spoiling his life. It was a very strong comment about ageism, reality, marital relationships, and today it's almost happening on the screen most of the time, but at that time, radical. And I was very happy to be a part of that.
Do you tend to get the scripts of the plays of days and think, yes, this is what I want to do, and this is really an issue-driven one that I'm after? Or...
Well, I always welcome a script that has some kind of issue at stake and not just empty, you know. Obviously, this is a very important piece, and it's a classic, E.M. Forster's book. But I thought the way it was dramatized was absolutely brilliant. And it said so much about cultural conflict and about colonialism and being Indian or being English, and me being Indian as well. So, I mean, for me, it was a pleasure to work with such wonderful actors. And as you see, you know, in that particular sequence, it says everything. If you're familiar with the story, it's about a woman who accuses somebody of raping her, and of course it may not have been the case. And a lawsuit ensued, and she actually revoked her accusation, and that's the result. So I think it made a lot of sense, and it's issued, and it's, you know, says what it says.
And by this point, you're an established director, you're starting to make a name for yourself, and we're going to go to 1969 now, and the film A Touch of Love.
Yes.
Which was the first film that you helmed and directed.
Yes.
And I understand for that, you brought a lot of your old pals from your Cambridge days together.
Well, yes, I was very nervous. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, and I wanted a bit of support. And I was very lucky because a lot of the people that I was a student with had gone into acting. And so Ian McKellen, I begged him. I said, please be in my film. He'd never done a film before. And he said, no, I don't want to be a film actor. I want to be a stage actor. And now,
the irony.
Now I can laugh all the way to the bank. But anyway, but at the time, I had to really persuade him. And he said, oh, okay, I'll be a part of it. And he was wonderful in it, actually. Then I had, in the cast, I also had Eleanor Braun, who was a friend of mine, and another friend of mine called Roger Hammond. So I got them to say yes, and I think we had a great time. But it was another issue drama. It's about no, this is way back in those days. Single woman decides to have a child by herself because the father, she doesn't want to tell the father who, actually the father is bisexual and she doesn't want to let him know. So, but in those days you had to be very euphemistic about the reasons, about who he was and what. But it's about an upper middle class girl who suddenly finds herself having made that decision to keep the kid. But the realities of having to deal with the problems, the social problems, the NHS at the time, the crowded waiting rooms, the whole educational factor for this woman who starts off there and ends up there. So it was a great privilege. Again, it's an issue movie, but full of warmth, full of humour. And Ian, I thought, to this day, he saw himself the other day. By the way, we screened this at the National Film Theatre last year because I had a season of my work being shown, and we showed this in its entirety. And Ian came to see it, and he says, oh my goodness, wasn't that pretty then?
Well, we'll have a look at him in a moment, because we've got a short clip, actually, because I think this audience would kill me if I didn't show a clip of it.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Just before we do it, it was one of those, it's very much the kitchen sink drama, that issue-led. Obviously, you were all young graduates of that time. You'd had Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, you'd had A Taste of Honey. Were you all, at that point, that movement was moving on slightly, but were you all angry young people in that vein at that time? Or?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because this came at a time. The point about this is that Ken Loach had just done Up the Junction and Cathy Come Home from the BBC stables. That was also about a single mother coping, but his world was a gritty world, shot basically in black and white in a totally different way. And mine was a parallel story about a single woman wanting to bring up a child. But her social status had to be shown, in my terms, in the world she lived in. So I couldn't do the gritty thing, except when she encounters the NHS and all the inefficiencies thereof at the time. I'm not going to indict that wonderful institution, but it is critical and criticised. Anyway, so I had to do it in a specific way, and the technique I used was to shoot it in as a compact but as visual a way as possible, without handheld or the resorts that some of the other realistic films were being made. There is a contrast, but there's a similarity, of which I wish to make that note, because watching it you'll see what I'm talking about. It's the way I shoot it and the way the performances come across.
Your time at Cambridge, there were quite a lot of people who've gone on to have very big careers as well. We've mentioned some there, but you were also at Cambridge at the same time as Peter Cook and David Frost, weren't you?
Yes, I was, yeah.
And they've obviously gone on to have careers in different spheres as well. What,
Yeah.
what was the culture like at Cambridge at that time?
Well, you know, I don't quite know how to place it, because it comes in waves. You know, after our year, there was others who followed, and we followed people as well. We were just very lucky at the time, because there was a lot of interest in the theatre, and we all wanted to be involved in acting and directing and that kind of thing. So it just happened that this incredible well of talent was there, and we all knew each other. So I mean, that happens when you're at university anyway. You don't have to be anywhere specific like Cambridge or anywhere else. But when you get a group of young enthusiasts who want to express themselves and have the facility, which is what we got, we kind of bound up together. So it was easy for me to be able to say to friends, look, this is what I want to do, when we finally left and went into the wider world. And that's my access to people like Ian, who's a friend of mine now, I mean, obviously. But I can't get used to him being like this person who is now adored and followed everywhere. I mean, I just have to smile a bit and say, well, that's the way we go. This is where our paths have left us. Anyway, so that's us.
It's a very interesting time. And there's a couple of historical productions that you're involved with in the early 1970s that we'll talk about. One is Henry VIII and His Six Wives, the feature film adaptation of the Keith Michelle Henry VIII, what was the BBC drama, and Shoulder to Shoulder, about the suffragette movement as well. Well, that's raised a few murmurs amongst the audience. Do you have an interest in history? Or
Very much. I love history. I love reading historical books. I love finding out about what happened in the past, because I firmly believe the past influences us today, if only some people thought about that. But the reality is that whenever I was asked to do something like this, of course I would jump at it. The Henry VIII was already a hugely successful television series, but it was basically focusing on each wife every week, each of the six wives. When I was asked to do the film of it, because of the success of the TV series, I initially said I didn't want to be involved because it had already been done on television. But the producer said, no, we want to do a feature, but we have to find a way of doing it without copying the TV show. The only thing was that I said, if we do it, Keith Michelle, who played Henry, was brilliant, and we obviously have to have him, but I'm going to recast all the wives. And that's what I did. And then I had to find a way of telling this story, 2 hours, and in the 2 hours you got 6 wives. And what do you do with that? So I had a writer who was brilliant. I said, you know what, Ian? He'd actually written one of the episodes of the TV series. I said, 20 minutes per wife. How can we do that? And he said, well, let me think it through. And then he came up with this brilliant idea. He said, what we've got to do is analyze the character of the king. Why did he do what he did to the people who were influenced by him? And 2 of them actually got beheaded as a result. How do we deal with that? And then, of course, he came up with this extraordinary idea about a man who started off absolutely brilliantly. He was a very good-looking guy when he was young, and ended up huge and gout-ridden and very unhappy. There must have been a psychological flaw here, and we decided that he actually never believed in anybody or anything from a very early age, when his first wife, Catherine American, kept losing the children that he had. She had many miscarriages, all of male children. And he began to think that he was cursed, partly because he'd married his dead brother's wife, because Catherine had originally been married to Arthur, his brother. And so we started to weave in the idea of psychological harm and damage and superstition, that he believed that up there he couldn't understand why he was being cursed. And indeed, he only had one male heir at the end, except for one illegitimate one. But the fact was he had two daughters. One of them was Mary, and the other one was Elizabeth. So the whole story is about a man who actually cannot trust. And once we got that line, everything fitted in.
Yes.
Because then we saw each of his wives having to cope with a certain degree of paranoia. And that made the story. And we told the story in 2 hours with 6 wives.
And it was still, I mean, I'm a child of the 80s, and it was still being used in my sixth form college as a sort of definitive telling of the Henry VIII story in the mid-2000s. So it's stood the test of time.
I have to say I'm very proud of the look of it, because when I had a wonderful cameraman called Peter Sushitsky, who went on, by the way, to do the early Star Wars. He actually set the tone for the Star Wars. And Peter also did my very first film with Ian and who we saw just now. I said to him, Peter, let's look at the pictures that we want to base this on. And we looked at a lot of Holbein paintings. If you go to the National Gallery, you can see the influence. And he lit all the scenes with that incredible look of a Holbein painting. And it just gave it an extra something which I don't think the television even actually achieved. And I was also very lucky to have fantastic actors other than Keith Michelle. I had Charlotte Rampling playing Anne Boleyn, and she was absolutely wonderful. And Donald Pleasance playing, I think Thomas, no, what was it, Thomas More, not Thomas More.
Cranmer?
No.
Wolsey?
Oh, sorry?
Wolsey?
Not Wolsey. Thomas Cromwell, thank you.
There's too many Thomases in that time.
Too many Thomases. But
they all
no.
end up dead one way or another, don't they?
No, and no, I had a wonderful time recreating that period, because I was always obsessed by it. So I was happy to be able... Shoulder to Shoulder, something else. I didn't have any knowledge about the suffragette movement, but Verity Lambert, who was responsible for allowing me to be with her after we both started our television lives on Doctor Who, as you will know, when she became head of drama and got me Edward and Mrs. Simpson. And after that, the suffragettes, which was amazing. I didn't know anything about the Pankhursts, and then I realized that they actually came from Manchester, and that's where the whole movement started. So I had to recreate that period, and from that we moved into the whole political saga, you know. And again, I had a fantastic chance with great scripts and people like Sian Phillips, who I thought was a definitive Mrs. Pankhurst. So I had a great cast again, you see, and because of that show, I know a lot about the suffragette movement, and I'm very proud to have been a part of it.
And it's one I'd absolutely dearly love to show a clip from, but it's only been one episode was repeated on BBC 4 about 10 years ago. I'm astonished with all the anniversary of the suffragette movement, but it's something that's not been shown again.
I was amazed that they didn't schedule it for, it was 100 years ago, last year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That they didn't reschedule that show. I mean, I just couldn't understand why not. It's a very odd thing. I grew up at the BBC. I love the BBC, but I can also be very critical of the BBC. I don't understand some of the things they do, quite honestly, or their decisions.
They have the facility to repeat it. It is astonishing.
Yeah, it is astonishing.
But it was also very female, understandably so, very
female-dominated
production as well. How did yourself fit into that?
Well, I was one of the few men involved. The rest was all female producers. Actually, it was great. They were way ahead of their time and way ahead of the Me Too movement, right? They were very strong on why they wanted to make this saga, and Verity asked for me. The other two were a bit dubious. They wanted females doing the whole thing, and she said, I don't want this to be a kind of ghetto for just women. I want a male point of view in the story. And she complimented me by saying Waris is very good with actors and actresses, especially working with actresses. So she recruited me, and I had a wonderful time. And actually, we shot up here because we were trying to do Manchester in the 1890s. And of course, we couldn't find anywhere in the real city. We actually shot Manchester in Halifax. There's a particular street there, I don't know whether it still exists. Wonderful street with cobbled streets and the built houses where they all could have lived. And so we recreated Manchester. We also shot in some of the open areas out in the countryside and in the mills towns. Some of them still existed where we had to see working girls coming out of the mills.
Yeah, there's still quite a few mills around this area in the north, isn't there? And that was 6 nearly 90-minute pieces as well, so it had a tremendous reception at the time.
Yes, it did.
And let's hope we do get another chance to see it at some point.
I hope so.
But one thing I think a lot of people might be familiar with in this room is Edward and Mrs. Simpson.
Right.
Almost The Crown before The Crown, in a way.
Yes, on much less money.
It's always the way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Clive James, who was the television critic of The Observer, at the time, he said this is the kind of script that directors dream of. And is that something that you thought at the time?
Absolutely agree. Beautifully thought out, very complicated subject, because up till the time we made this, the legend was the greatest love story of the century. You know, the king abdicates for the woman he loves. Well, if you actually dig underneath all that, there was a lot of complications and political problems too. So it was based on a book by Frances Donaldson, who'd done her research. And we found an enormous amount that has never been said. So the romantic element that had been given to the public in order to justify the abdication was that, in fact, would he have been a good king? And the posters ultimately said, greatest love story of the century, ? Or a nation betrayed, ? Because the politics behind that abdication were huge. And I actually asked a question. I said, look, he wanted to marry this American divorcee. She was actually not as strong as she seemed. She was quite vulnerable. And when the crunch came, I said, why didn't Queen Mary, who was formidable, by the way, summon her to the palace and say, how much do you want, honey? Get the hell out. Didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because I think at the time they realized that he would not be a good king. They needed to find an alternative. Now, George, his brother, was a stammerer. He was physically weak, but he was a man of integrity, and he had a very strong wife, the Queen Mother. What's better? What's the better choice? A playboy king who sympathized with Mussolini and potentially Hitler, or somebody who would have to get into the chair and deal with it? And that's what I think was behind all this. And the Wallace Simpson actually was fragmented by the time the king gave his final speech. She was sobbing in France, saying, for God's sake, David, don't do this. She called him David. But he'd already committed himself. And I think he never wanted to be king. However, once he was exiled, then he realized what he lost. That was his tragedy. The rest of his life, he wandered the earth, remembering what he had. But to my mind, that whole saga is not just a love story. It's a political scandal. And it also tells you about how the newspapers dealt with it, which is what we're going through today. What do you publish? What do you tell the public? What do you not tell the public? The British public actually were kept totally in the dark. The Americans knew about it because of Wallace. So, you know, when the abdication was announced, people were hysterical. They were shocked. They couldn't believe that this very good-looking king who said he was for the people was betraying the country. It was a very complex story, and we had to tread very carefully because, don't forget, his actions, his abdication meant that the present Queen's father took over, and the present Queen's uncle is who we're dealing with. So we had to be very careful how we portrayed this couple, and I thought Edward Fox did an absolutely brilliant job.
Absolutely.
I mean, he was Edward to the T. He got it his abdication speech, by the way, if you ever get to see it and listen to, they sometimes play the real one on the radio, wherever. Edward got it absolutely, even the hesitations, the tone of voice, and he did it all in one take. Didn't do it more than once. One take.
Well,
brilliant.
Guess what? We've got the clip of it.
Oh, yeah.
So the scene is a little bit longer, but let's have a little look at the first part of it, because it is absolutely astonishing. Oh, it's tense, that, isn't it? It's very tense. And multi-award winning, of course, at the same time. It does seem to be something, having spoken to a few people and doing my research for this, it seems to be something that the country stopped for to watch as well.
Oh, yes, well, at the time it was being broadcast, that was it. I mean, people rushed home. Well, you know, today they do that with certain shows. But at that time, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned The Crown, because I think it's as good.
I think you're right. I think you're right there. Just moving on to something over the pond a little bit. You did a musical with Barry Manilow, of all people, as well. I can't say it, so Copacabana. I've been practicing that one in the
Cabana.
mirror.
American.
Of course. It had a $4 million budget and a 22-day schedule to complete. Yep. It's an astonishing piece of work. And I understand it came about because Manilow was approached to do a variety special and instead suggested doing a movie based on one of the songs.
Actually, he always fancied himself as an actor, you see. And this was his opportunity to combine the two, because he played Tony from the song. And the whole musical is based on his song, this famous Copacabana song. So it was a very interesting get-together. I was a straightforward director. I'd never done a musical in my life. And he met me with Dick Clark, who was a famous entrepreneur. And we talked. And Barry finally gave in to the idea of being directed by a drama director as opposed to a musical director, you know. So I said, the only way I can do this, Barry, is if you totally accept the fact that you've never acted in your life. And I'm going to have to tell you how to do it, and you're going to have to trust me. Otherwise, we're just going to be a mess. So no, Waris, I'll do whatever you want. And then he promptly went off and started being coached by a very famous actress. And of course, he'd come to the studio. And he'd start acting this scene. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I was told that this is how I should." I said, "Barry, great. When you're with her, you're just alone. You're now surrounded by others. How do you propose to relate to them?" "Oh, I didn't think about that." "Well then, think about it now. Listen to me, relate to them, do what you know, and then I'll help." And that's how we worked it out. And actually, it was great. We never fought. He'd done some original songs for this. I've never got over the idea of why they never were published, because he wrote original music for this, not just the Copacabana song, obviously. And I thought they would publish a record or something of these new songs for his fans, but it didn't happen. But anyway, we had a ball, and the film turned out to be a tribute to the old MGM musicals. If you're people who love musicals, you should understand that we actually tried to copy with our limited budgets not the big MGM money they had, but the kind of thing that we had. We had scenes in cabarets, we had chorus girls with fabulous costumes, we had dance numbers. Now, I have to tell you this. The person who deserved the Emmy, which we won, and I was given it, but I feel that the person who deserved it was the choreographer, a man called Grover Dale. I watched him shaping these dancers from these huge auditions to the numbers he actually found and putting them into the dance numbers. It was just, I was knocked out by it. And I learned so much by working on a musical, which I'd never done before, so I'm very happy about it.
He looks like he's having an absolute time of his life doing it.
He did. We had a great time. It was the first time I'd experienced being with a famous musical star. I even got into a limo with him at some concert because he invited me to come to his concert. And I couldn't believe the way the fans were rocking the limo to the point where I thought we were going to turn over. I mean, they were all besieging him, and he was interesting. He just took it with a grain of salt. He loved all the fan worship, of course, but I said to him, how can you go through this? I said, I love being anonymous. And he said, well, you're not really. And I said, yes, I am. Compared to you, yes. So that was me, and that was him.
Astonishing. Well, we have got a clip from the climax of the movie, which of course features the title song. So we can see the glitz and the glamour. So,
are you all familiar with the song? I hope you are.
You're going to be in a minute, and if anyone wants to, feel free to get up and dance during this as well. Then
it's one of those songs that everyone knows for one reason or another.
Now, it's fair to say that was very well received, actually.
Yes, it was. Yes.
In the research I've done, it was screened quite a lot of times across America when it was on. I have found one review that didn't particularly like it so much, though, which I think this is grossly unfair. This is obviously someone who's not a Barry Manilow fan.
Ah, well, there are quite a few of them, yes.
Annette O'Toole proves her acting chops with the simple fact she doesn't vomit uncontrollably the moment that Barry's lips touch hers. Still, his character acts like God's gift to AM radio and displays an ego almost as big as his nose, which I think is grossly unfair. But this, of course, it did win an Emmy.
Why don't you read a better review? Why don't you tell us how wonderful he is?
I did chortle on that one because I thought to myself, no, that's not. But it's a lot of fun. And do you wish you'd done more musicals, perhaps?
Yes, I do, but I've never been asked. So what can I say? I won the Emmy, though. I've got it on my windowsill at home.
And it's well worth it. I had a lot of fun watching this. I thought it was brilliant. And something that I found equally as interesting was a programme called Intimate Contact, which you came back to Britain to do, which delves into a bit more of a serious subject. And actually, we've got an unrelated clip here from EastEnders from the same year, 1987, which might just put into context what we're going to talk about. So let's dim the lights once more, and you've got some vintage Dot Cotton coming up here. That was transmitted in 1987, and EastEnders was regularly getting audiences of 10, 12 million, and the audience reaction, I think, said it all there, that it's a completely different time, a completely different era, and Intimate Contact was a two or three-part drama that was on ITV that dealt with heterosexual AIDS, wasn't it?
That was the first drama about AIDS in this country, actually, and at the time it was regarded as the gay plague. Nurses were putting trays of food under doors and wearing masks and things, and all that went on. In fact, in ours, what happened was the person who wrote Intimate Contact, a woman called Alma Cullen, very good writer, she heard a whole group of men having a big nudge, wink, wink about, it's a gay thing, And she said, look, I'm sorry, but I don't believe that. So this could spread anywhere, and it's not just men. And so she decided to write a drama about a married man who contracts the illness by consorting with a very high-class prostitute in New York on a convention. He's a businessman, and he's gone. They're celebrating their success in a business deal, and they bring in the girls, and he has sex with this girl and becomes infected. So basically, the story is about a wife finding out that her husband has got AIDS, and she can't believe it. And she was played beautifully by Claire Bloom. The husband was played by Dan Massey. And the whole idea is, she kept saying, "Are you sure it wasn't with a man?" And he says, "Don't be so stupid." The marriage is falling apart. But apart from that, the rumor spreads where he works. And all his colleagues start to back away. This is very early on, don't forget. Today we're used to the idea that people can take medication. But in those days it was like a death sentence. So he finds himself being alienated by his colleagues and having to deal with it and the shame of it all. So the drama was about something very strong, about prejudice. And at the time, AIDS was very, very highly suspect. So you've got to put that in its context. We even had a scene where the doctor describes to the wife what it actually means. You don't get it off the toilet seat. You get it through, exchange of fluids. And she's trying to understand this, but she's really upset. And she lies about it to her friends. She says, "Oh, he's got cancer." But the doctors know and everybody knows. And the writer was very clever because she doesn't just stay with the heterosexual couple. At the hospital where she visits her now dying husband is a gay couple, and she sees that guy taking care of his friend. And to start with, she doesn't want to meet them. She doesn't want to meet these two. And gradually they start talking and they become friends. And the two who are about to lose their partners become close as a result of their potential losses. There's a very strong story point to all this. So I was very, very happy to be a part of this, because I felt very strongly that this statement needed to be made at a time when there was huge prejudice.
I think that EastEnders clip, which is, it's not a throwaway comment in a soap opera, but that kind of, this drama explores that prejudice and explores
in detail, in a lot of detail, not just in terms of narrative or hearsay, but there we are in the face of it.
And the human detail. And Claire Bloom, it gives, both Claire Bloom and Daniel Massey give extraordinary and
fabulous performances.
But a tremendous success, and thank goodness we've moved on so much since then as well. We're going to open it up to the audience for a few questions now as well, if anybody's got them. If you want to raise your hand, and we'll bring the boom mic over, and if you just wait for that, we'll be in position before asking the question. That'd be super. Has anyone got any questions? We've got a hand that's shot up right in the middle there. So, what?
I really like Melody, which is a film with a lot of child actors.
Oh yes.
How is it different working with children to the adult actors?
I'm glad you asked, actually. Again, first for me, I'd not worked with kids before. And again, something that I treasure very much. I had the advantage of working with two very professional children at the time, Mark Lester and Jack Wilde, who'd made their reputations on Oliver. Actually, it was because of the success of Oliver, the musical, that I was able to make Melody. It was written by Alan Parker, who's since then become an eminent filmmaker, and produced by David Putnam, who was his first film. It was with music by the Bee Gees. And that, again, was, I think, way ahead of its time, because the script was written to fit in with the music rather than the other way around. They're doing it now with things like Bohemian Rhapsody and with Rocket Man. But in those days, the entire script was based on the songs. And the Bee Gees had written a wonderful score, some of which existed anyway. And then we had these kids, and I had to marry the music to these kids who were 11, 12-year-olds. And it was a joy. They were so natural, and I really love it. So all I can say is that it was a privilege, and I'm happy to have done it.
And it's actually being repeated, I think, next week on the Talking Pictures channel on Freeview.
Oh, is it?
Well.
Well, if you guys get Talking Pictures, do see it, because it's got a really good quality to it. Again, my cinematographer, I seem to be working with him a lot, but he's now way out of my league, having done Star Wars. Peter Fashitsky, he shot it, and again, it looks brilliant. I mean, it's London in the 70s, which doesn't exist anymore, But if you're interested in seeing London as it was, it's really lovely.
Thank you very much. Any more questions from the audience at all? We have one at the front here. Just wait for the boom mic to come over. What's your question for us?
So we saw with the play for today, which was very much in the mould of many BBC dramas of like the 60s and 70s, probably even up into the 80s, where it's very much a mix of filmed exteriors and then you have your multi-camera interior in a studio. How did you find transitioning from your work on TV in that style towards the more sort of like the film style? Because we saw, you did your film in 1969, but then the Wallace Simpson and Edward drama, there's very much a change in like the cinematography style. It feels a lot freer.
Yes.
Was that something you adapted to quite quickly?
I did. Actually, it's an interesting question because having worked in multi-camera dramas, you learn a hell of a lot about what you can and cannot do and what the limitations are. When you're finally freed with only having one camera, the mentality still tells you how to be economical and how to frame your shots. And because there's a certain freedom about having just one camera, not to bother about cables like these on the floor and people crashing into each other, etc. So in a way, it was a step towards what I ended up doing. The single camera now, of course, reigns. Everybody uses them. Multi-camera is only used, I think, in comedy shows, things like that. So, no, for me it was a progress. And then when I went back to Edward and Mrs. Simpson, even though it was multi-camera, I already challenged myself to use those cameras much more fluidly. Although I've been told that the very initial stages of the Doctor Who series, even though they were very early on, I was very influenced by cinema. So I always tried to emulate the images on the screen in terms of camera movement. So I had to somehow get over the restrictions of working in a studio, but I love the fact that now, of course, there's so much fluidity with a single camera. But I've married the two in my head.
Got a chance if anyone else has got a question? Oh, we've got one right down the front here, straight up. Let's get in position.
Hi. So, as you said with Play for Today, it was an example of having theatrical plays staged for people in their homes, those who couldn't get to theatres and all that sort of stuff. And I suppose today the evolution of that is companies like the National Theatre who screen live in cinemas their plays. I know it's been quite a divisive thing throughout that some people love it, some people disagree with it. Mm-hmm. But I wonder what your thoughts are on it, and if you got asked, would you direct a live play direct to cinemas?
Well, if I was asked to do something like that, I'd be interpreting the original director's concept and interpretation. I mean, I haven't been asked, so I don't know how I'd react, but my initial reaction would be one of reluctance. I have actually put on camera a stage production that was done by John Schlesinger at the at the Royal Shakespeare with Peggy Ashcroft, called Days in the Trees. And when they brought it to television, John didn't know how to do television at all. He did single camera films. And I was asked to take over his direction. So I said I would do it, but we'd have to reconstruct the set because that was a stage set. Now, what you're talking about today, they are working off the stage and in the theatre. What I did was to take it into the studio, and we built our own sets. And I was able to be much more fluid and add many more spaces that the stage couldn't accommodate. So it was a different way of interpreting someone else's work. But then if you're working on a John Schlesinger directed piece, then you don't complain. And also I had Peggy Ashcroft to deal with. So it's a double whammy as far as I was concerned.
Lovely. We'll be taking... Oh, we've got one more question. Go on, we've got one more question there, just at the back.
Yeah, sorry.
Go on. What's your question for us?
Hi, Waris. Basically, a lot of the stuff that you seem to do, that what we've been sharing today, is all about educating people, even, I think, even doing...
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'll speak up a little bit. All the stuff we've been shown about your work appears to be about educating people, even going straight back to Doctor Who, and even sort of doing the musical, I think, like about stretching yourself and what, you know, you're always seem to be learning and trying, doing that sort of shaped.
Well, I've always wanted to... Look, the point about doing anything is to keep people's attention and to entertain them. But there has to be a purpose for why I'm doing it. I mean, look, it's very interesting because I'm not somebody who wants to preach, but I love to be able to show people in situations where they have to learn something from what we're dealing with. So without lecturing, you know, the human condition is very fragile in many ways, and there are many ways of telling stories. I mean, all you have to do is watch television today. A lot of it is based on crisis or family problems or someone being sick. Or you know, we all have basic instincts. The thing about love letters, it's about a man facing death. And he says we're all going to go through it. And that makes you think, oh my goodness, let's enjoy what we have right now. Let's enjoy this piece of art. Let's look at the landscape. He says, I'm going to miss all this. To me, that is so touching and moving because I feel that's what we're all in for. And we're all so busy complaining and running around saying this doesn't work, that doesn't work, that we don't actually say to ourselves, actually, we've got to have something to live for, whether it's in a relationship with another person or something that you absorb yourself with, whatever you may be good at or what you try to be good at. I'm not a preacher, but I love to read a script which has a purpose to it. And I love issues, whatever they are, and then you deal with them in the most human way. I'm not a... You see, it's very interesting. I've been asked to do horror films, and the problem for me is I can't stand visual violence. And that's not only horror, but, you know, anything that shows graphic violence, to me, is unnecessary. I've dealt with... I did a film called The Possession of Joel Delaney, which is all about a killer on the loose. But I never showed the violence. I showed the result of violence. To me, that's the best way of dealing with it, because we live in a violent world, but you don't necessarily need to see someone chopped up in front of you. The results of someone having been chopped up are as bad. But unfortunately, we're become immune to violence. People have asked me to do horror. I can't do it. I cannot do it, because it means that you're seeing someone suffer. And you can see someone locked in a room and be threatened by the unknown. That's frightening. Or in an empty house and being threatened by something. That's horror. But don't let's see the result of that. The act of it, but you can see the result of it. And that's my feeling.
And Waris has just completed for us a commentary over An Adventure in Space and Time, the 2013 drama about the genesis of Doctor Who, which will be available to download as well, which we hope everyone enjoyed. And that drama, obviously, astonishingly, it's 6 years old now as well. But how realistic was it in terms of presenting the challenges that you faced, the people that you encountered at that time?
The drama itself as portrayed, or as it really happened to me?
As portrayed. Is it an accurate reflection?
No, I thought that, you know, when you're doing, a 2-hour drama, you have to have a certain element of freedom in accuracy, you know. So, in fact, I thought Mark Gatiss, who wrote the screenplay, did a very good job. I think the best part of it was that he had to make a decision. He was asked to do a script about the origins of Doctor Who. Now, there are different ways of approaching this. And what I think he did brilliantly was to focus on one character, who was William Hartnell. So he tells a story about the making of Doctor Who via William Hartnell. He could have chosen to do it via Verity or via me even, but that wouldn't have been as interesting. what he did was he chose this one character, William Hartnell, who initially did not want to do the film or the series. In fact, that's very accurate on the screen. He said, no, I don't want to do this. I'm a movie actor. Because he was very successful in film. He was never a lead. He was always a secondary. I mean, he was in things like Brighton Rock, brilliant. But then gradually he meshed into what he played. And so what Mark got so cleverly was the progression of this man who finally accepts the fact that he's become, at this stage in his life, a major star at the hands of children and the world. So that was the brilliance of the script. Of course, Mark had to cut down on a number of things, but what he got was the essence of the relationships. The whole idea of William being reluctant, then accepting myself and Verity. You've got to understand something very interesting here. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Brit from the Second World War. To be suddenly faced with being produced by a female was already, oh my God, what's happened to my life? And then by this little Indian guy who he doesn't quite know how to deal with. And I could tell you a quick story. He challenged me. I mean, the first day of rehearsal, we had these markings on the floor. And I said, William, I'd like you to move from here to over there and then over here. And he said, oh, I don't think I want to do that. And I said, where do you want to go then? He said, well, I want to go over there. And I said, fine, William, just fine. Just as long as you know that you're going to walk offset and I won't be able to cover you on camera, so I'll wait for you to just come back. The moment I answered him on that level, he knew that I knew what I was doing. He was testing me. And this gradually developed into a relationship. By the time he left, it was quite emotional, actually. By the time I left, because I left after doing the Marco Polos. And it's interesting, Mark Gatiss got a sequence here where there's another director, and he calls him Waris. Did you notice that? He's forgetting his lines on the studio floor. And at one point he says, oh, hold on a minute, Waris, but I wasn't even there. Mark got that into the script to show his decline as a character in his mental state. So that's how these things evolve,
And of course, it touches on, it crams in a number of the personalities, in fairness. But there are other people around at the time, like Donald Baverstock, who's the controller of BBC One, Ron Grainer, we see a snippet
Composer.
who composed the theme tune. What do you remember of these larger-than-life personalities?
Well, I never saw Donald Baverstock. He sat upstairs on the 6th floor. He made the decisions. He was the controller. No, obviously I knew Ron Grainer because we discussed music. And he was very much involved in the whole concept of how to present this. So that was a part of my life. And I was there, it's iconic now, I was there at the very time we recorded the music for Doctor Who, which is now, has become a staple for everyone's recognition. Delia Derbyshire, brilliant woman. And the first images of that, by the way, those plumes of white, they were actually the idea of putting one camera facing the cathode tube of another, which created those images, and that's what stayed. It's rather like the Gorsak test, when you do ink and you see what the pattern comes out. This is the moving example. So, but I was there at the day that we recorded the Doctor Who theme. So, and by the way, that's on my ringtone on my phone. So if you ever call me, you're going to get Doctor Who. I've been in all sorts of funny places. I was at the airport lining up to go through security, and my phone went off. And everybody turned around, and they all recognised it. I thought, oh my God.
It has gone on to become utterly iconic, that theme tune.
It's totally iconic. Yeah.
And absolutely cutting edge at the time.
Yeah.
And obviously, An Unearthly Child spearheaded Doctor Who, and it started it nearly scuppered by the worldwide news that the assassination of Kennedy.
Oh, God, it was...
And do you remember where you were when you found out?
Oh, yes, absolutely do. It's like, you remember certain moments in your life, and that was one of them. Oh yes, absolutely remember that. I thought it cannot be worse. I mean, first of all, the death of a president, but secondly, this is the end of the show. Why would they bother with it anymore? It's an omen. But of course, thank God it wasn't, you know. But it was dramatic, and that, again, Mark used it. Yeah.
And the show moves on. The Daleks are a huge success, and you come back to helm an historical epic, Marco Polo.
Yes.
A 7-episode story, so it'll be told across 7 whole weeks. And
Yeah, in Studio D, which was half the size of this place. Sandstorms, God knows what. I mean, you know, but we did it. And I think it's a considerable achievement, not just on my part, but on the part of the designer, Barry Newbury, who was brilliant. Because we had all sorts of, in the story, they travel across the deserts and different way stations that they had stopped at, which is historically a situation. And his genius in converting these places architecturally with the same material every week was, I thought, stunning. And in the end, when we arrive at the court of Kublai Khan, I don't know how he used that space, but if you actually shoot it on a certain angle from a camera, it looks vast.
yes.
And the sadness of that episode, those episodes, is that the colors were fabulous with all the Chinese kimonos and everything else. And you can't see them in black and white. You can see them from stills if you've got
We're
photographic.
quite lucky. There's a lot of colour stills from Marco Polo.
Yes,
there's a lot of them that
yes.
seem to be going around.
But the Marco Polo, you see, by the time we got to that, the show was a big hit. Big hit. It was no longer just for children. Adults sat in with their kids and watched. So, you know, by that time it had already become a name in everyone's home. And the budget went up. Although we were still locked into Studio D, Lime Grove, which I go on about. But the fact was, it was a miracle that we made it happen.
Well, I've got Studio D at Lime Grove was 84 by 65 foot, apparently, which is not... I'm not quite sure the dimensions of the studio that we're in, but obviously not necessarily all that's usable
It was
either.
not. It was about this size.
And you've got to cram in 4 or 5 sets. the
Major
police
sets,
prop.
yes.
I mean, it just about says it all when the actual TARDIS prop doesn't fit in the scenery lift to take it up.
That's right.
And is there anything particular that's, apart from the conditions, that sticks out about Lime Grove? Because I never realised it was at the end of a suburban street until looking into this.
Neither did I. I dreaded going there every week. What else? Studio D. Well, look, I can't really say much about it except the cameras there were not the same as the cameras in Television Centre. They were much heavier. They were the size of a man, 6 foot probably, and heavy to push. And the lens changes were quite different from the ones that had evolved at the Television Centre. But I was determined not to let that stop me from shooting the way I like to shoot, which is to give a certain kind of fluidity to the movements of the camera. And the poor camera guys, I think they could have sued for back trouble afterwards, because they really had to hold these huge things around because I was asking them to go from here to there in one tracking shot, you know? Not easy.
I think we forget that those cameras are not necessarily capable of zooms. So if there's a zoom,
No, they
someone
weren't.
pushing it.
Exactly, yeah.
Because there's a few dramatic zooms that you see in programmes done at Lime Grove at that time. And you forget it is someone shoving the camera along as best as possible.
And don't forget, they all had thick cables that had to be held behind them.
I mean, for the
Much
benefit,
thicker than these ones.
yeah, for the benefit of the people watching at home, we've got some cameras in the studio, obviously filming this. We've got cables on the floor, and it is a mathematical equation.
It is.
Not
If you can
overlap
think
them.
this is a mathematical equation, think of drama with 4 continuous, you know?
And Marco Polo is a script that takes in a complete journey from almost one side of the world to
To the other, yes.
When you got that particular script, obviously it's a completely different one from the Caveman story
Yeah.
in Earthly Child. What were your initial thoughts on it?
Well, I actually worked with the writer, John Lucarotti, who had done his research. He was a very, very clever guy. He wasn't making things up. But I said to him, look, we've got to be very careful how far we can go with this, because this is not MGM, we're not on Hollywood. This is Studio D Lime Grove. So we've got to contain some of the story points, and he adjusted accordingly. Though we had sandstorms, that's another story as to how we did sandstorms. But we did it. We did it.
And it was very
With
well
certain
received
degree of
as
skill.
well. There's a Doctor Who author called John Peel who has said that if a single story could ever sum up for me the wonder of Doctor Who, it would be that one, Marco Polo. It's gorgeous, fast, tense, funny, and filled with character and feel for the period. Marco Polo is one of the true classics of television.
Wow.
Which is high praise indeed on that one. But I think you've got that unity of the set design.
Set design, costumes.
The costumes.
And mainly casting, although I would say now there might be a few riots because we didn't have enough Oriental actors to play Chinese. So you can imagine there was a lot of eye stretching going on amongst Caucasian actors. But on the whole, I think we did as well as we could.
And it had a cracking cast because you had a young Mark Eden. Who
Absolutely,
later
Mark Eden, yeah.
fame as Alan Bradley in Coronation Street, amongst other things, in one of his first TV roles.
Yeah. Well, Mark was always very good looking and striking, He looked like a hero figure, which we needed. And I had a wonderful actress called Xenia Merton.
Yes.
Who played the Chinese girl, and she was fabulous.
She must have been very young at the
Darren
time as well.
Nesbitt.
Darren Nesbitt.
Yeah.
Who was a mainstay as a baddie in a lot of ITC serials at that time as well.
That's right.
He gives a very impressive turn as Tagana, the villain of the
yes.
piece.
Lots of leather.
That must have been unbearable under the studio lights as well.
I tell you a very funny story. There was an actor called Tuti Lemkov. I don't think you probably remember him. He played one of these guys who never quite knew in the script whether he was good or bad or a spy. And I had, Tuti Lemkov was actually a dancer. And I said to Verity, I really think this guy has to have somebody with him because he's so weird. Why don't we get, and in those days I said, you shouldn't say those words. Why don't we get him a dwarf? And Verity said, Waris, you don't say dwarf. I said, a little person. And she said, no, we do not have a little person available. So I said, well, I need something to accompany this character. So she said, well, what do you suggest if you can't have a person? I said, I got it. What about a spider monkey that sits on his shoulder? Because most people have parakeets or some sort of, bird with a beak. I said, what about a spider monkey? So she said, well, let me think about it. And she said, all right, I've looked at the budget. You can get a spider monkey, but you've got to get a handler and all this. So we got the spider monkey, and he had to be trained. And he had to sit on Tuti Lemkov's costumes, like this very elaborate costume. And we go for a take, and it went 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Loud shriek and screams. The monkey is shat all over. all over. The smell in the studio was unbelievable. And we had to vacate the set. And Verity said, that's what comes of spider monkeys, Waris.
I let you, Waris, and this is what happens. I never worked with animals.
Anyway, that's one of the funny stories.
Oh. And obviously, Verity must have been a lot more assured, and she's finding her feet in this production now. She's brought in the Daleks, she's broken Sidney Newman's golden rule of no bug-eyed monsters, and it's really gained traction. Can you remember if there was a difference when you came back to the programme as to how she and the behind-the-scenes team were finding their feet on it? Or is it
Well, it wasn't like a huge difference instantly. It just evolved. We all had that confidence. I mean, suddenly I'm walking around saying I'm directing a show called Doctor Who. Oh, well, really? Can I buy you a drink? That was the kind of attitude. I'll tell you another funny story just before we go further with it. My mother had a guest over at the house, a very famous actress, and she brought in with her then partner, very handsome guy, and he's sitting in a corner by himself. And I said, oh, and what do you do? And he said, well, I've just done a film, actually. And I said, well, what's it called? And he said, it's called Dr. No. And I said, oh, I hope it doesn't conflict with something I'm doing called Doctor Who. And that was Sean Connery. So there we are.
And that's another franchise that's gone on to celebrate its 50th year, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. And that you wouldn't get him just popping in nowadays, would you?
No, you wouldn't, but then I have to say I had the privilege of knowing him, actually, subsequently. Very nice man, very nice guy.
And his son later turned up in Doctor Who as well, much later on.
Yes.
And you'd helped shape William Hartnell's approach to the character of the Doctor. Back at the Genesis, making him that little less spiky and more grandfatherly. Did that have to continue throughout the second story? Or was he a little bit happier?
No, he'd eased into it, and he was much better. You've got to remember that William was a very individual kind of person as an actor anyway. He had his own quality. You've got to encourage it and not suppress it. So by the time he was doing Marco Polo, he was very much at ease with everything. Mind you, became quite grand.
Yeah.
That was all right.
I was going to say, does he need
Not grand in the awful way, just,
more self-assured,
Yeah.
perhaps? Because I'm wondering, I saw a comment on a letter that he wrote to a fan in 1965.
Oh,
and
I
he
wrote
said,
a letter.
He wrote one.
Oh, he
so,
wrote
yes,
one, I
he was
didn't.
being
Okay.
asked by a young fan
Yeah.
all these kind of questions. There's one that seems to have recurred, which is that he finds film the easiest medium because you can stop, start and redo things, television the hardest, and theatre the most rewarding because you have the warmth and appreciation of the audience. So was he someone who needed that and perhaps wanted that instant adoration and found television a bit more difficult as a result, do you think? Or
I think you've probably answered your own question, yes. I think definitely, as a part of it. Don't forget, the whole point about William was he was an actor from way back. That was his life, The odd thing was he found this kind of success so late in his life. He'd always been used to working, but as a second string, never in the lead. And now he was this person who was recognized wherever he went. So you've got to give him that award for his achievement.
yeah, and without him, I suppose without him, there'd be quite a few people who wouldn't be sat in this room at the moment
That's
as
absolutely
well.
right.
And
Yep.
Marco Polo gets the first Radio Times cover for Doctor Who as well. And although it's at the week of transmission, so you might have sewn up what's being done, moving on to the next programme, how important are things like Radio Times covers? Because Passage to India got one. And
I
other
was very
elements.
fortunate. I've had about 3 or 4 covers from my life. Well, it was very important. I mean, it's changed now because there's a whole different format. But in those days, the Radio Times was, like a newspaper. I mean, people looked at it and they got their programs from off of it. I mean, ITV was still very young and not there yet. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
BBC was the Bible for television watchers. So they would go for what they saw on the cover. We were very anxious to know what was on the cover.
So I appreciate that Doctor Who wasn't on when it originally started.
No,
The first
well,
one, it took
if you look at the first announcement of Doctor Who in the Radio Times, there was a half page in one version, and then subsequently were tiny little announcements. At 6 o'clock there will be Doctor Who. It didn't push itself a lot at all.
not like the splash that you see for programmes nowadays, by any stretch of the imagination. John Luke Carotti is a name that, for Doctor Who fans, they'd associate a lot with historical stories. But what do you remember of him? Because he's a little bit of an enigma to Doctor
I don't
Who
really
fans.
know much more about him other than working with him.
him.
We didn't socialise or anything like that.
I take it there'd be a lot of staff writers and directors in the BBC at this time that paths would cross and you'd see people?
Not really, no.
It's not that kind of culture.
No. Each of us worked within the framework of what we were working on under certain producers. When I moved on into the Wednesday play and the play of the month, it's different producers all the time. I had my own office. And even that could be moved. Sometimes they'd come in and say, Waris, we're moving you to another room because somebody's coming in here to do something else. You were never permanent. But I actually used to go to the person who used to organize staff, you know. And I did ask for one particular assistant she was brilliant with me. And she became a friend, actually. It wasn't just somebody being told what to do. And I used to go in and I used to say to the head of the allocations, I said, please would you see that Judith comes with me to my next job. Sometimes there were times when I wasn't doing anything and there'd be a gap in production and then Judith would have to go off somewhere else. So nothing was permanent.
Not even Television Centre itself,
No.
it seems, nowadays. No.
No, you befriended certain people, certain designers who you like working with or having a drink with. Or camera crews you hardly ever got to see or know beyond the camera studio floor. There's one guy who was absolutely brilliant and everybody wanted him. He led Crew 5. Everyone wanted Crew 5 because this man called Jim was absolutely brilliant. And you'd put in your application for a crew at least 2 months before the production.
It's quite a... Douglas Canfield's a chap that you worked
Doug
with.
Canfield was my PA, yeah.
And his attitude towards military precision, I think, is well known and well documented. How did you find his approach to getting things done?
Doug and I had a very complicated relationship. He couldn't quite figure me out because he wanted to be in my seat.
Yes.
And he was always trying to test me. Not in a bad way, not in a sort of aggressive way, but it was always like, if for some reason I failed to answer a question or solve a problem, it was like, yeah, well, I thought so. And I would not give him that. Pleasure too often. No, in all fairness, he was a very nice guy, but bewildered by me. That's the only thing I can tell you. And then in the end, when I'd left, he actually took up directing anyway, and directed quite a lot of them. But at the time, he was just working with me, but curious as to how I got there. Let's put it that way.
Do you have any memories of doing the BBC Directors course? This
Yes.
famous...
What about it?
What would it entail? Because
Well,
obviously it trains you and gives you the skill
well, look,
set
I was
to do it.
trained in everything I know to this day by the BBC, so I'm very loyal to them. That trainee course is finished years ago, but they taught me everything I know about television or filming. And all I can say is that it's a shame that organization has not able to maintain that kind of thing for new young talent.
Yes.
People have to find their feet elsewhere, wherever they can.
It is a shame because it does seem to be quite a nice, rigid syllabus that would get you up to speed with everything you need to know and set you up, like you say, with that skill set that carries you through a career.
Originally they took me on for 6 months on the possibility of... there were 5 of us who came in from the outside to the trainee course. And when I was there, I was on a tightrope because I literally thought at the end of 6 months they could fire me and then I wouldn't know where to go. And it was interesting because the project I was given, I had to do a graduation piece at the end of the trainee session, which would allow the executives to watch my skills as a director. And people chose different things. There was a guy who chose a musical number, somebody else chose a dramatic number. I chose one which was self-contained. It had to be under half an hour. And I found, instead of an extract, I found a complete Tennessee Williams one-act play, which is exactly 20 minutes. And it was set in a brothel in New Orleans, And the theme was of a woman dying, the prostitute is dying, and the madam comes in and is asking her to vacate the room. Tennessee Williams being, on the side of victims. And it was set in one room. So what did yours truly do? I went to the designer, I said, this is set in a brothel. I don't want to do just one room. And he said, what do you want then? I said, I want a corridor, and I want doors leading off, and I want women coming in and out, and sailors propped up again. It suddenly became an epic. And then in the end, it ended up in this one room. And I thought, God, they're going to really punish me for this. I mean, I'm way over the top. Actually, the fact that I did do that helped me because I suddenly expanded with my imagination. And so that got me through the first step. And I didn't get fired. But the next test was I went out live on a show that was called Compact. It was every week, twice a week, soap opera set in a women's magazine. And something else happened. My first ever, because I followed everybody else watching, then my first time in the control room live, countdown, 10, 9, blah, blah. Suddenly we're on the air and I'm sitting in the control room telling the cameras what I think they should do. And the main camera that I'd given all the work to, when he was not shooting, suddenly started to shake his head to say, I'm malfunctioning.
Oh, no.
And now I've got 4 cameras. The one is malfunctioning, the main one. I've got 3 left. And I've got half an hour to get through this show without any... And it's like one of those 1950s movies where Doris Day sits in the pilot's place where the pilots collapse and she lands the plane. And so I'm sort of Doris Day landing the plane. And I'm so, camera 2, move to the left. Camera 1, don't get out of the way. 3, move there. You're on a close-up. And this was not in the camera scripts.
No.
And the vision mixer sort of like pushing buttons. We got through it without any problems, without any cameras shooting into each other or anything. And at the end of it, I just collapsed. They had to drag me up to the bar and give me a large drink. And the funny thing was, it was being watched by the executives who were judging me on my first stint in the studio. And they didn't know what had gone wrong. And then suddenly told them. That is what I think bought me my future at the BBC. Because they heard what I'd got through. How we did it, but it was a miracle. So there we are.
It could be easy just to go, no, right.
I know I could have just collapsed in the control room. But anyway, it went out live and no one noticed.
I think it's important to emphasise in that there's a lot of planning that goes in.
Oh,
especially
huge
on the
amount.
Recording day.
Oh, absolutely.
You spend hours looking at camera rehearsals.
Yeah.
There's sound vision checks, all the kind of stuff that our guests have seen here today. I mean, one schedule I've seen indicates that a recording day started at 8:30 in the morning
Yes.
and finished at 9:45 at night, if it ran to time.
That's right, exactly. Yeah.
Because I'm presuming it'd still be the time at 10 o'clock, boom, lights go out.
10 o'clock, lights go out. Union.
It's an astonishing long... And you've got days of rehearsal leading up to this
Yes,
with the actors.
a whole week of rehearsals at Doctor Who.
Which is, again, something that we don't necessarily see nowadays on this rehearse, record. Would you like to go back to that way of doing things? Do you think it's...
Well, it's not just me having that choice. The art of working under those circumstances is collaborative. Everybody on that crew, the lighting man, the sound man, the art of jockeying with cameras and booms and maps and all sorts of charts. You can't just say, I want to bring it back. You've got to retrain a hell of a lot of people again. I don't think it's possible.
No.
It's gone.
Which is a great shame in some circumstances. We've seen some quality pieces of work that you've done. Obviously, we started today with Love Letters on Blue Paper, and we saw earlier on some wonderful clips from the stuff that you've done over your career. Is there anything that you haven't tackled yet that you might like to do?
Do you know, I can't really think of anything like that. I mean, I want to continue working. I like, as long as I've got my marbles and I'm mobile. But I can't really say there's anything specific.
Because I think you've tackled almost every genre.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Yes, I have. I've had a very good run, but I'm still running.
Indeed you are. Indeed
Yeah.
you are. Well, time has very nearly beaten us, unfortunately, because I know our audience here want to have the chance to meet you in person as well. So we're going to start letting that happen. In the meantime, we'd like to put our hands together and appreciate a man who's given up his time to stay, Mr. Waris Hussain, ladies and gentlemen.